It was a humid Saturday morning in late June when I opened the door to my sister's guest room and stepped into a smell of cedar and dust, a smell of boxes unopened for too long. I had come over early to help her prepare for the 4th of July barbecue she insisted on hosting. She was in the kitchen making lists, and I had volunteered to freshen up the spare room where our cousins would sleep. I opened the closet to hang fresh towels, and a sealed envelope slid off the top shelf and landed at my feet. It was thick, heavy, with our father's handwriting across the front, unmistakable even after 10 years. Private for my daughters, it said. My heart jolted. Our father had died believing his last will was already executed, and our family had moved on from the bitterness of that estate, or so I thought. I stood there frozen with the envelope in my hands while the window unit hummed and outside birds bickered in the maple tree. My sister called from the kitchen asking if I wanted coffee. My mouth said yes, but my mind was a storm. I slipped the envelope into my bag, closed the closet, and told myself I'd ask her about it later, but deep down I knew I wouldn't. Not yet. Not until I'd read what was inside. I waited until I was back in my own kitchen with the late light sliding across the tile like it always does on June afternoons. I set the envelope on the table and just looked at it for a while. My father's handwriting had that old habit of pressing a little too hard on the downstrokes. It made every letter look decided. He had written private for my daughters, and the word daughters felt like a hand on my shoulder and a warning in my ear at the same time. I thought about calling my sister right then and saying I found something in your guest room. Did you know? But my fingers didn't reach for the phone. They reached for the butter knife in the drawer because my father taught me never to tear an envelope if you could open it clean. The knife slid under the flap with that soft paper sigh, and there it was, a stapled packet on legal paper with a blue notary seal, and a date that hit me like a thrown stone. 9 months after the will we probated a decade ago, a month before his last hospital stay. The title read Last Will and Testament Revised. My mouth went dry even before I saw the names. The first page looked like the earlier will, a few bequests to the church, a small gift to the library where he volunteered, the old lawyer's name in the header. But page 2 changed the weather in the room. He had handwritten an addendum in the margin, careful block letters like he wrote when he wanted no confusion. It said that certain items of personal property and the small lake lot should pass to me, not jointly, me by name, for the care and companionship given, and that the remaining cash from the savings account should be divided differently, to reflect contributions and needs. I read the sentences again to be sure I wasn't hallucinating. Then I saw the line that mattered most and hurt the worst. He revoked a clause that had given my sister the house free and clear with the understanding she'd refinance to buy me out slowly. Instead, the revised will said the house could be sold and proceeds split after paying off debts and a small mortgage I hadn't known existed because my father had quietly borrowed against the equity to cover medical bills he'd hidden from us so we wouldn't worry. I pressed my thumb to the notary seal like a person testing a bruise, and I kept reading. There was a letter tucked behind the will on yellow paper from his desk. The top said, "To both of you," and the first line said he hoped we'd never see this because he'd intended to sit us down and explain. He wrote that grief makes poor listeners and lawyers make poor translators of love. He wrote that he was proud of us in different ways, that my sister's talent for arranging chaos made her a magnificent mother, and that my stubborn patience had kept him in his home longer than the doctors expected. He wrote that fairness is not sameness, and that when a life ends, the math ought to account for the invisible work. I pressed the heel of my hand between my eyes because the sentence rang like a bell in a house I thought I'd left. Fairness is not sameness. I could hear him saying that when we were kids and I stayed home from the county fair with the flu. My sister went and brought me back a ribbon. My father sat on the edge of my bed and said, "Fairness is not sameness. We do not divide joy with a knife. We make sure nobody goes hungry." I folded the letter closed and then opened it again because it felt like he was still in the room. Then I saw the last paragraph and my heart shifted in my chest. He wrote that he had given my sister copies of everything so there will be no surprises, and my breath caught because either she had forgotten or she had not. He wrote that the lawyer would file the revision after a doctor's note cleared a timing question, and the lawyer's name was the same one we used, the same office with the cracked leather chairs. I thought about the day we sat there after the funeral with our faces stiff, and the lawyer told us the will was straightforward. I thought about how I had been too tired to ask the second question, the one I always tell my own kids to ask in banks and hospitals and offices. Is there anything you aren't telling me because you think it won't matter? I laid the papers flat with 2 fingers because my hands had started to shake, and I went back to page 1 to look for signatures. There they were, my father's name in that heavy hand, the lawyer's notary stamp, 2 witness signatures I didn't recognize. The date, clear as a sunrise, was 9 months after the will we used, so the new one should have superseded the old. I stood up because the chair felt too small and the room too close. I paced to the sink and back, and I asked the empty house what it wanted me to do. I can talk to an empty house now, I'm old enough. It will talk back if you give it time. And it said this: you can pretend you didn't see, you can call your sister and ask a question with a soft voice that invites a soft lie, you can call the lawyer and light a match, or you can put the papers back in the envelope, put the envelope in your bag. Go to your sister's barbecue and live with a pebble in your shoe the size of a fist. I poured water and gulped it like it might wash the problem down. Then I sat and read the letter again slowly, my father's careful words about invisible work and the way help costs time in a currency no bank prints. He wrote a small sentence to me that made me both proud and furious. He wrote, "You will want to pretend this is not a gift because you dislike being thanked with money, but please accept that my gratitude needed shape." I laughed out loud then, angrily and lovingly, because that was exactly the argument we had when he tried to slip gas money into my purse after I took him to 3 appointments in 1 week. He said my time had weight, and I said my love did too, and he said then let us not fight about what we agree on. I closed my eyes and saw him at the kitchen table with his oxygen hose looped over his ear, the way he tapped the paper when he had decided. And I realized I was not only reading a will. I was being asked to honor a conversation we never got to have. I picked up the phone and scrolled to the lawyer's office number because it was still in my contacts. Old habits die slower than old men. Then I stopped because calling the lawyer first would turn a family problem into a legal one before it needed to be, and once you put lawyers in a room you can never again say, "We were just talking." I set the phone down and picked up the envelope and slid everything back inside carefully. Then I took a pen and wrote today's date on a sticky note and attached it to the outside because paper trails matter. I put the envelope in the bottom drawer of the buffet under the placemats my grandmother embroidered, and I sat there with the drawer half open thinking about money and memory and how they knot themselves together. I thought about my sister's life, her tidy house, her 2 kids in college, the way she manages chaos like a general. I thought about my life, the condo I bought after my divorce, the part-time work I picked up after the credit union downsized, the car that needed a new transmission I kept pretending didn't. I was ashamed that my brain did this math automatically even while my heart was still touching my father's words. I made tea because my mother would have. Then I called my sister and said I could come over tomorrow to help set up tables, and she said she could use my extra coolers, and I listened to her voice for guilt and heard only lists and weather. After we hung up, I took out a pad and wrote 3 columns at the top: tell her now, tell her later, don't tell her, and under each I wrote what I could live with. Under tell her now I wrote honesty is a thread that holds. Under tell her later I wrote holidays might survive the summer if we can speak like adults. Under don't tell her I wrote sleep will move out of the house. I carried that paper into the bedroom and tucked it under my alarm clock like a coward and a planner. Then I slept badly with dreams that mixed numbers and keys and my father knocking on a door I couldn't find. I woke before the sun and made eggs I didn't eat and drove to the little lake lot I wasn't supposed to know was mine because I had never been the kind of person who drove to look at land. But grief and anger and curiosity can make you do errands you didn't plan. I parked at the gravel pull-off and walked down the slope where the cottonwoods lean. The water was still and a heron stood like a thought someone forgot to speak. I sat on a rotting plank and took a breath that tasted like algae and summer and childhood boat gas. My father had brought us here in a borrowed canoe when we were 10 and 12, and he had said the lake taught patience if you let it. We had not let it then. We had splashed and argued and tipped. Now I looked at the water and it did teach me something. It taught me that the thing in my pocket was both a map and a match. I could use it to find a conversation, or I could use it to set one on fire. On the way home, I stopped for groceries and forgot the milk. I put the envelope in my bag and told myself I would not let it leave my sight until I had a plan. Plans like company, so I made 3. Plan A was to bring the envelope to my sister's house today and put it on the kitchen table and say I found this, and I need you to tell me why it was in your closet and why we filed the old will. Plan B was to ask her if she remembered any revisions without mentioning the envelope and see what her face did. Plan C was to call the lawyer Monday morning and ask for a copy of anything on file after the first will, and if he said there was nothing, I would show him something. I rehearsed the sentences while I wiped the counters and watered the fern because people think we become braver with age, but the truth is mostly we become better at rehearsing. I drove to her house at noon with 2 coolers and a casserole and a small earthquake in my purse. Her kitchen already looked like a parade had marched through, corn husks in the sink, strawberries on paper towels. She greeted me with a flour-dusted hug and handed me a list. We worked shoulder to shoulder for an hour, and I waited for my courage to knock. It did not. Instead, small talk patted the air, and the window unit rattled, and the dog barked at the neighbor. Finally, while she was rolling out pie crust, I said, trying to make it sound like I'd found a sock, I was tidying your guest closet yesterday, and an envelope fell. It had Dad's handwriting. Do you know anything about that? The rolling pin paused. Her mouth made a line. She said which envelope, and I said the one that said private for my daughters. She said I don't know, maybe old insurance papers, and my heart made a fist because when I lie my sentences come with too many maybes too. She lifted the crust to the pie plate and said casually, "Where is it?" And I said I took it home because the heat might curl the paper, and she looked up sharply, then softened her eyes like a curtain. She said, "Oh well, Dad was sentimental. He wrote letters he never mailed. Remember the one he left in the tackle box?" I nodded because I remembered and because I was watching her hands, not her mouth. Her hands were steady, but they were pressing too hard on the dough. I said I think we should read it together, and she said after the barbecue, "Today is too busy." And there it was, the first small no that hangs a calendar on an argument. I said okay because the kitchen was full of cousins and the clock had stood up and started jogging. We finished the pies and set up the tables, and the afternoon filled with people and paper plates and the song my uncle plays on repeat every year. I wore that envelope like a second skin and smiled in the right places, and when she leaned over the potato salad and whispered, "Later we'll talk," I nodded. Later means after the last guest leaves, and the last dish is dried, and the last child has stopped crying, and the dog has stopped circling, and the house has told the truth to the furniture. Later can become a season if you let it. By 10 o'clock the yard was dark and the cousins had gone, and we were 2 sisters again in a kitchen that smelled like ketchup and lemons and fatigue. I took the envelope from my bag and set it on the table, and the room changed temperature. She looked at it the way a person looks at a closed door when they know what's behind it. She sat down and put her elbows on the table and said in a voice that was both my sister and someone else, "I knew you'd find it eventually." I felt a part of me stand up inside and cross its arms. I asked why it wasn't filed, and she said because Dad changed it again in his head, and we argued, and he never went back to the lawyer, and then he died, and the lawyer said the earlier will was fine, and I didn't see the point in rebreaking what was already broken. I said the notary seal says he did go back and the date is clear, and she said quietly, "I know what it says." I said did the lawyer know, and she said he knew there was a draft and a note about a doctor's statement and that Dad wanted to talk again after a test, and then the test never happened. She said I have a copy too, and I have looked at it 100 times, and I have put it back 100 times, and I have prayed 100 times that this would not be the thing that finished what grief started. I said the revised will has witnesses and a notary and our father's signature. I said it supersedes the old one if it's valid. She said the lawyer told me there might be a question about capacity on that date, and that any challenge would be ugly and public, and that Dad would hate that more than he hated unfairness. She said I chose quiet, and I said you chose for both of us. The sentence sat between us like a cracked plate. She said you were exhausted, and you would have said file it just to make it done, and I said you do not get to write my part in the story because I was tired. We sat there until the refrigerator motor kicked on and reminded us the house also needed to live. Then she said, do you need the money that badly? And I said, I need the truth more, and also yes, because the transmission doesn't care about my principles. She almost smiled because that sounded like something our father would say. Then she said, if we open this door, we will never close it the same way, and I said, doors are for going through, and my voice shook. She put her head in her hands and said, I thought I was protecting Dad's dignity and our holidays and my own sanity, and maybe I was protecting the part of me that is terrified of losing you. That sentence cut the knot in two, because it was the first true one of the night. I reached for her hand and said, we can go to the lawyer together on Monday and ask for the file and ask about the doctor's note and ask about the witnesses, and we can decide as grown women whether to file, to mediate, to split, to rewrite our own agreement in the shape of fairness is not sameness. We can do it with the door open and with our father's sentence in the room. She nodded without looking up and said, okay. Then she said, I'm scared, and I said, me too. Then we did dishes like we did after our mother's wake, in silence with hot water and the knowledge that hands can do one good thing while the heart waits its turn. When I left, I took the envelope with me because I had brought it and because my sister asked me to keep it safe. She said, I know you will, and then she hugged me like a person who had been holding their breath and finally decided to inhale. I drove home past the dark lake and the sleeping houses, and I told myself that Monday would be a day that wanted courage, and that courage would look like two women sitting in cracked leather chairs asking for the whole file and the whole truth and deciding together how to honor a man who taught us that gratitude needs shape and fairness isn't a ruler, but a table set for two. On Monday, my sister and I sat side by side in the same cracked leather chairs at the lawyer's office. The room smelled of paper and dust. We placed two identical envelopes on the table. I said, we want to see everything that came after the first will. The lawyer opened a drawer and pulled out a thin file. Inside were notarized copies, letters, and a short note from the doctor about our father's condition. We sat in silence as he flipped through the pages. Then he looked up and said, legally this will hold. But if one of you contests it, the process will be long and public. My sister clasped her hands. I said, we don't want a war. We want the truth. The lawyer nodded and left us alone. That's when our argument finally erupted. We spoke loudly, but we didn't shout. We brought up childhood, promises, old resentments, years of invisible work. She cried and said, I was afraid you'd hate me. I didn't know what to do when I found this paper. I wanted quiet. I answered, silence is also a choice. But it hurts as much as a lie. We sat there until the refrigerator hum from the outer office became the only sound. Then the lawyer returned with a pen and said, you can sign a settlement that reflects the spirit of this will. My sister took a deep breath. I placed my hand over hers. She nodded. We signed a document that provided for the sale of the house, the division of money, and shared ownership of the lake lot. The lawyer said, your father wanted you to decide what's fair for yourselves. When we walked out of the office, the spring air felt different. My sister wiped her eyes and said, I was more afraid of losing you than of losing the house. I hugged her and replied, we were both afraid. But today we made a choice we won't be ashamed to remember. That evening I drove to the lake. My sister came after me. We sat on the old dock watching the water in silence. Then she said, I finally understand that fairness isn't formulas. It's the courage to be honest. I nodded. The sun touched the water. For the first time in years, we felt not just sorrow but relief. I thought about that July morning in the guest room, the smell of cedar and dust, the envelope falling at my feet. I realized our father's real legacy wasn't in parcels of land or bank accounts, but in teaching us how to solve conflict without hatred. I'll leave you with this question. What would you do in my place if you found an envelope containing a loved one's will that changed everything? Would you tell the truth and risk the family, or keep the secret and live with it?